Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Associate Director of Library Museum Programming here at the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to today's virtual discussion with Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson on her new book, Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World, published in 2020 from the University of Pennsylvania Press. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hogan, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose relationships and connections to the land continue to this day and into the future. The Society expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of the Lenape, as well as that of numerous other Indigenous communities and individuals throughout the continent who have offered guidance, expertise, and opportunities for collaboration that make the work of the Society's Library Museum possible. For those of you joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who've made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing over $1.5 million in grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. Please check out our website, amphilsoc.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. We're using Zoom webinar for today's virtual discussion, so not to worry, you've all been muted. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom center of your navigation bar. You can type your question in there at any time during the presentation today. We're going to leave plenty of time at the end for a question with our speaker. We're also very happy to offer closed captioning for today's virtual discussion. If you'd like to use it during the planned panel, during the presentation, please click on the CC box at the bottom navigation bar of Zoom, just to the right of the Q&A button. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker. Jessica Marie Johnson is an assistant professor in the Department of History at the Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Johnson is a historian of Atlantic slavery and the Atlantic African diaspora. She's the author of Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World, University of Pennsylvania Press, August 2020. The book has deservedly won a slew of awards. And I should say our captioner asked if I was going to read the entire list. And I said, I want to read the list because it speaks to just how important this book is for a range of different fields. So this book has been honored with the Frank L. and Harriet C. Osley Prize for Best Book in Southern History, granted by the Southern Historical Association, the Rosalind Turborg Penn Book Prize for Outstanding Original Scholarship on Gender and Sexuality in the African Diaspora, granted by the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, the Wesley Logan Prize in African Diaspora History, granted by the American Historical Association, the Laura Romero First Book Prize, granted by the American Studies Association, the 2020 Kemper and Lila Williams Prize for Louisiana History, granted by the Historic New Orleans Collection and the Louisiana Historical Association. And it was a finalist for the Pauli Murray Book Prize in Black Intellectual History, granted by the African American Intellectual History Society. Dr. Johnson is also co-editor with Lauren Tilton and Dave Nimmo of Debates in the Digital Humanities, Computational Humanities. She's the guest editor of Slavery and the Machine, a special issue of Archipelago's Journal from 2019, and co-editor with Dr. Mark Anthony Neal, Duke University of Black Code, a special issue of the Black Scholar. Her work has appeared in many other journals, including Slavery and Abolition, the Black Scholar, Meridians, Feminism, Race, and Transnationalism, the American Quarterly, Social Text, the Journal of African American History, the American Quarterly, and so on. And her book chapters have appeared in multiple individual collections. We are so grateful that Dr. Johnson was willing to join us today and share her new book. I will be putting into the chat that there's a 40% discount for those of you who want to go out, and I think all of you will want to go out and buy the book. So I'll put information about how to take advantage of that discount into the chat. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Johnson.
Hello, hello. Hope everybody is doing well today. Thank you all so much, the American Philosophical Society, for having me. I was just saying in the green room that it really is an honor to be here. It's such an important institution, and it's such an important work that's getting done by scholars here. So thank you so much. I am going to share my screen. So be just a little bit patient for just a moment. And I don't have many slides, just a few images that I think might help ground us in some of the geography and some of the topics of of the book. So I guess I should start out by saying that I am a historian. I'm a historian of Atlantic slavery and the Atlantic African diaspora. My research is very much rooted in historical inquiry, but I've also been trying to be very accountable to methods and theories and other concerns beyond the historical profession, historical methodology. So I'm very much beholden in this book. This book is very much beholden to women's studies, to ethnic studies, to Black studies as well, and the kinds of frameworks that have emerged from those. And it's very much in a longer tradition, particularly of Black women historians of slavery, who have really, for me, charted a path not just into thinking about how to navigate the profession, but into how to read documents, how to navigate the archive, and how to engage with sources that are not, on the surface at least, very forthcoming, but actually can yield some really amazing gems of information about what Black life is like in the early modern era, and what it means to be and to engage Black womanhood in a period during slavery. At the end of the day, many of the questions that this book is animated by, Wicked Flesh is animated by, are questions of Blackness, of sexuality, of bodies and power. They're also questions of diaspora and its many archipelagos, of which, although it is very much rooted in the place that becomes known as New Orleans, that before that was described as Bobancha, which in Choctaw is land of many tongues. Although it is rooted there, it is making a broader claim that the sites like New Orleans, but which I think, in biased fashion, New Orleans is a particularly important template for understanding this, are also sites of diaspora, are also sites of movement and mobility, and also spaces where Africans, particularly enslaved Africans, in their route to manumission and in their questioning of definitions of freedom and the meanings of freedom, really shaped into communities and societies that the world had never seen before and has yet to see again. And so I think that there are some things to learn about how Blackness operates during slavery, what African diaspora is and its meanings, and how we can learn something more about freedom as well as intimacy from the ways that enslaved Africans engaged the experience of bondage and demanded something more from the ideas of freedom that were circulating in this world. So Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom is very much animated by all of these questions. And its organization is also about ways of centering African diaspora. So it is, as I say often, is a history, a Black feminist history of the founding of New Orleans. And in that, one of the things that was really key for me was grounding the root and history of a place like New Orleans in the history of the African continent and of societies in the West African context in this case. And so the first chapters of the book are very much about the ways that Senegambia is very much a part of New Orleans history, of Gulf Coast history. And in that, there's an argument to be made that they range in the different African societies, and particularly in the Atlantic African coast, but also deeper in the countryside, are also part of histories of Africans in the Americas. The first 3 chapters are grounded very much in Atlantic Africa and Senegambia during the era of the slave trade. The first chapter, which I'll talk a little bit more detail in just a moment, really describes the ways that the polities of the Senegambian coast, thinking of the polities of the Wolof, Wallot, Kejor, Bewal, the Seer, the Lebu on the coast further south, how these were in a long relationship, tense and intimate, and strange and violent, and for some very lucrative, with Europeans, with first the Portuguese and Spanish, who arrived in the 16th century, with the Dutch as well, and that these points of contact very much preceded where the French began to arrive in the 1620s, 50s, and 80s, but also laid the foundation for some ways of interacting, some economic relations, sociocultural relations that would also shape what the French encountered, and how Africans, particularly African women on the coast, encountered the French in return. And I also think that one of the things to learn about these encounters is that there is a history that's longer and older than the 18th century to be gleaned, even if we're focused primarily in the 18th century in our histories. And so it was very important to me in tackling Senegambia as a self-conscious place that is also engaged in an Atlantic commerce and Atlantic engagement, but has its own history. And that history doesn't begin with the arrival of the French or the founding of Saint-Louis, not even the founding. The French, take it over from the Dutch and the Portuguese and fend off the British. But do not begin necessarily with the French. And that Atlantic contact is much earlier. And even mine is sort of truncated, because you could argue that the kind of North African contact with the Iberian Peninsula even precedes even that, and that there's an even longer history. And I think that is an argument that I am very excited about. That's not where this book went. This book didn't go that far back, because you can only do so much. So this book focuses, for the most part, in grounding us in a Senegambian context that has a long history of European interaction and Atlantic interaction. And then thinking about, okay, so what happens then when the French arrive? And so chapter 2 is very much about the ways that a community and a society as Saint-Louis emerges as French officials, company directors, sailors, soldiers, shipmasters, captains, artisans, as we'll see, begin to try to engage with trading networks that are emerging out of up and down the Senegal River in particular. And it talks about the ways that one of the key spaces for interaction is intimate, is between primarily French men and African women of various statuses. So some are free African women, and there is also captives du casse and captives actually on the different comptoirs, different sites, who are also who are enslaved. And so what does it mean then to be sort of born of this place, right? It engages, very much engages Ira Berlin's concept of Atlantic Creoles, but does it from the context of women and of community and of kinship, and how this community emerges. Chapter 3 goes into an even deeper analysis of what being in this place is like, not necessarily for those who are born at the comptoirs or along the coast, or who have a kind of community and communal claim to being part of these burgeoning societies, even if those claims are not without their own violence, and they very much are, as I'll discuss in one of the key stories of the book, Marie-Bode story. What does it mean to enter into these communities from the other side, from being enslaved? And so La Traversée is chapter 3, and is very much about what this slave trade from the interior of the continent to the comptoirs, and then eventually on ships, and it follows the particular ships that go to the Gulf Coast. What does that look like? And what is that experience like? And what can we learn about it from the context of those who are understood to be women and girls? And here I also talk about the ways that gender is a particular configuration that is getting made and unmade in the same moment in this period. This is a chapter that gets us across the Atlantic with some stops in the Caribbean along the way, just as the ships also stopped at places like Grenada, Saint-Domingue. This is a chapter that moves the whole book, though, across the Atlantic to the Gulf Coast. And there, one of the things that is a key piece of how to think about what changes when we really center the African continent in our analysis of slavery in the Americas. A key piece here are the ways that the experience for women, for all captives, but focuses on women, on girls, on these ships is not of being, purchased or embarking from a place like Gorée and then disembarking at New Orleans or Belize or Ship Island, these other sites along the coast that then you would go up the river over land to New Orleans. There's this experience of being captured, kidnapped, taken from points all along the route to Saint-Louis and Clay, and then being taken again. Upon arrival, not just staying in New Orleans, but moving up and down the river to different plantation sites that emerged in the wake of the attempt at plantation monoculture that emerges in the first few decades of the 18th century in Louisiana. And so I talk here about the ways that this is not just kind of a middle passage. The middle here is actually grayer because the ends are grayer. This is actually a long middle passage from one world of indigenous African life into another world of indigenous in Native American ways, geopolitics between indigenous polities like the Natchez, who end up revolting against the French. Policies like the Choctaw, who are sort of playing the French and the British in South Carolina against each other, and smaller polities, the Tunica, the Chaucas, the Huma, and others, who are all trying to figure out what to do with these strange newcomers, the French, but also are trying to figure out what to do with these strange newcomers, Africans as enslaved, and are increasingly compelled by the utility and the fungibility of enslaved people as property. So the discussion here is very much about what does that middle passage do to the experiences of women and girls in their thinking about what it means to be who they are. Keeping in mind that Africans enter ships with their own histories, their own understanding of the world, their own ways of thinking that come with them. But there is something that happens and that is reshaped in that thinking, and that kind of the violence of that and the creativity of that is what is discussed and kind of emerges in this chapter through this long middle passage chapter. Chapter 4, 5, and 6 are very much situated on the Louisiana side of the Atlantic, and are very much about how can we better understand what that experience of enslavement and bondage is in the context of the Gulf Coast and in the wake of this longer history, right? So chapter 4 is about what does property mean in a world in which the intimate value of enslaved women, of African women, even folds into those women who are increasingly securing some kind of manumission in this world. What is the value of that? And it talks about the ways that commodification of enslaved people is actually also has a kind of intimate currency that goes along with it. Chapter 5 looks at the ways that enslaved women and girls fought against this. And that includes everything from attempts to secure manumission through legal means, petitions, official channels, and unofficial acts of absconding and of freedom. So what are the kinds of spaces and geographies of pleasure and spirit that are created in this world? What are the kinds of moments of which there are a few that are described in that chapter where confronting the infringements on their freedom and on their personhood and their subjectivity happen sometimes with absolutely devastating consequences. But for me, it's important to think about the ways that these things happen anyway. And the last chapter is about that, what happens and the transition to another empire. So the arrival of the Spanish fundamentally reshapes property relations, definitions of race with the introduction of the casta system, definitions of patriarchy, honor, and freedom. And what does that do? Like, what are the ways that enslaved people, are able to access freedom in a different way using the Spanish in the introduction of the formulation of coartación? But there is also a kind of new and embodied definitions of property and honor and freedom that also begin to both coalesce a free population of color and also confront some of these more radical solidarities that are happening across race and class that predate the Spanish period. Throughout this text, it was really important for me to try and deconstruct a few things. So although I'm talking broadly about women, one of the things that was important for me was to try and think about what it might mean to write a Black feminist history that did not presume that we actually knew what woman as a category is or would be or could do. And for this, I was very much guided by the iconic text by Horton Spillers, Mama's Babies, Papa's Mamie, an American Grammar book, in which he talks about ungendered as a way of thinking about what the process of creating the Atlantic world, whether it's the slave ship, the processes of commodification and racialized labor, all of these, how that actually is not just a confrontation of labor or legal personhood, but it's also very much a confrontation of gender. And so Wicked Flesh is trying to think through this history of slavery while also trying to unthink some of the assumptions that as historians and scholars we've cleaved to. And of course we have, because there's something very powerful about being able to say in the slave ship register, there's X number of women, there's X number of girls. So, in some ways, that is also a really, really key piece of our methodology and of how we've constructed histories of women and girls. Is also something that we want to always sort of take with critique, particularly as we're thinking about the ways that gender conventions are being challenged by queer and trans scholars and by queer and trans communities, and the ways that we should presume that queerness, transness in different names, in different formations, but the practice of it, of course, exists in an earlier period. So how do we go to some of our base assumptions and really kind of challenge and situate that? One of the other things that I, really kind of tried to take seriously in the larger praxis around this book and approach to the book is that there is a world that is in formation in this moment of the 18th century, and so but it's not the only world. And so of course I'm very much beholden to discussions of the Atlantic world and that history of the Atlantic world scholarship, and I very much understand this book to be part of that, and to be part of also an Atlantic African diasporic scholarship that is so critical to understanding relations between both sides of the Atlantic. I also wanted to think with the ways that there are multiple Atlantics. So in this text and in this archive, this historical narrative and story that I tell, for me, New Orleans needed to be really kind of the compass north. And so what is New Orleans' Atlantic world? And so there was an argument in here as well, which will be familiar to scholars in New Orleans, Louisiana, that New Orleans' Atlantic world is inclusive of all of these places, even places I didn't discuss as much as I would have liked, although I did find them in the archive, like Cayenne. That there is a portrait to be made of the worlds and relations that connect a place like New Orleans. But I also want to stress that there are other portraits that are also possible, and what might those look like? So what might a text like this, centering the continent still, but rooting out of Benin, Ouida, look like? What would that history look like? What would it look like if we told that history also from Congo, Angola, which is one of the large sites of the reopening of the Spanish trade in the 1770s, 1780s. And those are not necessarily histories that I was able to delve deeply into in this text. But I think that there's so much space. One of the arguments I want to make is that, and I hope the book makes, is that this is one of many portraits that are layered on each other, and that all tell us something about the world that New Orleans made. To think of Ned Sublet's text, but also think about what is the methodology for better understanding African and their descendants' experiences across these worlds. One of the stories that is an arc in the book that really helped me ground so many of these different geographies and times and spaces, these different layers, right, is the story of Marie-Bode. So Marie-Bode in 1724 is the wife of Jean Pinet. Jean Pinet is a gunsmith based at Saint Louis, and Saint Louis is the island that's pictured here. She is the daughter of a French man, as far as we can tell, and she is a slave owner. She's a free African woman. It's described as a mulâtresse in the documents, and she is part of this longer history of French and in particular Wolof interaction in this region. So one of the things I talk about in the book are the ways that out of these interactions and descended from earlier interactions in Portuguese and the Dutch in the same region and Wolof and Lubu women, emerges a cohort of women who end up being described as senhores, and senhor is a derivation of senora. And the senhores are women who, through a host of reasons, and so this is to very much push against the kind of romanticization of African women who are seducing French men in order, even onto and in order to acquire economic goods. And that's not to say that that is not necessarily a part of the experience, but also part of the experience are the ways that intimate partnerships through and the use of female intimate partnerships and reproductive labor is very much a part of polities negotiating with strangers and negotiating their own geopolitics. So the extent to which women are becoming partners, economic as well as intimate, with Europeans who are arriving, range from voluntary to not very voluntary to roles that they're taking on as part of their households, which are often patriarchal households, even as Wolof society is largely polygynous. So there's a range of reasons, range of rationales that lead to the actual acts of partnering. But these partnerships also create a cohort in which, as European men arrive, they're also often leave or die. The État civil is full. It's mainly roles of French men, primarily French men and some other European men, who are just expiring on the African coast. And so as they do, the property that they have acquired falls to the women that they left behind, wives and daughters. Their marriages are not Catholic marriages often, and I want to very much shout out the work of Hilary Jones, who has been very instrumental in describing and talking about the Métis society of the 19th century, at Saint Louis in particular. These are marriages, part of the key feature of that society is not engaging in Catholic marriage, but engaging in what the French describe as mariage à la mode du pays, so marriage in the manner of the country. So marriages that are in custom follow kind of fusion of Catholic and Wolof custom, but and as well as in practice are also as formal and as formalized as any kind of Catholic marriage. So the wives and daughters inherit the properties of men who either expire or leave, and in doing so create quite a lucrative situation for themselves. The Marie-Bode is part of that larger tradition, and that larger culture and custom and happening. So her father, actually gifts Jean Pinet and her an enslaved boy as part of their marriage nuptials, and gifts also gifts enslaved boy to the priest, the person who officiates the ceremony. So Marie-Bode, we meet in the context in which free African women of a certain cohort are very much acquiring property, in a context in which she may or may not have been of mixed race, but certainly is claimed by this a French father, in a context in which she is a mulatresse, an African woman, and is very much in this relation, a wife of Jean Pinet. Jean Pinet is largely the reason that she ends up charting across the Atlantic. Just a few quick slides. The region that we're talking about here is this is an 18th century map, Biam map of Senegal. We have Walo, Kejor, and Beowul outlined here in color. And then this is possibly the earliest representation of Le Signat from Dominique Lamidal's, I think 1789 text. So, so Jean Pinet, Jean Pinet is one of the reasons, is the reason that Marie-Bode kind of really surfaces in the archive. Through an act of violence, she ends up giving testimony about herself, which gives us some biographical data about her. And then that same act of violence ends up having him expelled from Senegal, back to France at a moment where the Company Indies is in desperate need of populating its new colony with French laborers, and gunsmiths are very much a key artisanal skill in the Americas, in this Atlantic world. So Jean Pinet ends up in, of all places, Louisiana, and at some point in the late 1720s, he wishes for his wife to join him. And so Marie-Bode ends up becoming one of these unique figures that we hear about in the historical archive. We can join her with Anna Kingsley, Rosalie, La Femme Poulard, who becomes Rosalie Vincent in Louisiana, Penda Lawrence, who ends up in South Carolina, Anne Rossignol, who Dominique Rogers and Stuart King have done such amazing work on, who ends up in Saint-Domingue. These key figures who, through a host of unique circumstances, appear in the archive and show us the ways that free African women may have charted and moved across the Atlantic. But Marie-Bode also shows us some other things. So in the book, I talk about the ways that intimate violence is a really, really key piece on both sides of the Atlantic, and Marie-Bode's experience gives us also some register into that. Marie-Bode's experience tells us a little bit something about some of the ways that life at places like Saint Louis and Gorée operated within compounds like this. This is a much later image, but this image gives us some sense of the kind of intimate spaces that Captis Ducasse at Saint Louis and Gorée might have lived in. Marie-Bode gives us an opportunity to think about what the slave trade meant on the Senegambian side, the kinds of celebrations that attended the trade arrival and departure, and these are economic celebrations. Obviously, they're like celebrations of wealth coming back to the comptoirs, but they're also relief. As those who were laborers on these trading caravans come back safely. These are not journeys that are not without their dangers. And they're also a reminder that for at least a few months of every year, these comptoirs are primarily female spaces, and they're primarily African female spaces. So Marie-Bode's story gives us a chance to think about what, again, more of what life is like at these comptoirs. Marie-Bode gives us an opportunity to think about the ways that Grey and Saint Louis for the French are very much interesting fabrications of what kind of society they would have liked to imagine and control. That at the end of the day, the French, like many European entities at these comptoirs all up and down the Atlantic African coast, for most part are renters, they're guests. They have to rent space on the islands. They have to, they pay yearly customs, they pay duties on every item that they trade. They are, they have to, at Saint Louis and Grey, they have to get water and subsistence items from the coast, from the damels of the Wolof and their agents. And so these are incredibly vulnerable positions. And so that gives us a chance to think about, you know, the kinds of material, documented material that's created that tries to create a logic of mastery and of empire and of control, but actually are taken with a level of objectivity and seriousness in our present day moment that perhaps we actually should critique. So for example, the organization of this map is like, here is the village de Comet Christian, who were laborers, Christian laborers, as described by Wallon, the map maker. Here is the village of the Bambara, which were arguably either an ethnic group or enslaved soldiers, or enslaved laborers who were laboring for the French. Here is the village where the habitants lived, who were the free Africans who lived at the comptoirs. Very, very neat circles, separated in their various interests and sections of the island, and a complete falsehood. This is not how life on an everyday basis would have been lived. And so Marie-Bode gives the chance in the story of her interaction with her husband that I tell in the book, and the kinds of testimony that she gives, and the crimes that Jean Benet is accused of. All of these help us chart some very interesting ways of thinking and rethinking how to understand this world. And all of these also help us end up with, you know, a little bit more context on Africans who arrive in Louisiana. It helps us understand something about, you know, what is the story behind, for example, children who arrive and encounter indigenous polities. What is the story? This little map of New Orleans. For Africans who end up at the various plantations, whether across the river, as this image from the king, a very small detail from a plan from the King's Plantation shows. For me, it helped ground this idea that that if we're going to really kind of center a way of thinking about polities at Saint Louis and Corée as, you know, like as a new way of thinking about what these interactions might look like, and we have to see New Orleans as also a comptoir. We have to see the French there as also essentially renters, a minority population that is struggling to figure out what these interactions look like, and see Africans as both landing in familiar geopolitical circumstances and unfamiliar situations, with the key difference being that the lever of power and the monopoly of violence is not on African side, it's on the French side. So one of the, end up here, there we go. One of the, when thinking about Marie-Bode, one of the things I talk about is her journey across the Atlantic, which is incredibly brutal. She's actually on one of the, she embarks on a slave ship, and she's actually on one of the most deadly voyages that cross the Atlantic. The ship, La Galette, actually ends up having to stop in Saint-Domingue and switch crew. because a bout of disease had so decimated not just the captives on the ship, but also the crew themselves, and before it could continue from Saint Domingue to Louisiana. So there's also that experience of, this experience of the slave ship of the Middle Passage that we can begin to learn more about and glean some details from the slave ship registers, and also from thinking about what this would have looked like to this free African woman who was embarking in this world. But one of the key pieces that I think is interesting is that she arrives in Louisiana in a key moment. She arrives at Legalite is one of the last slave ships to cross the Atlantic, and it crosses in the same moment that the geopolitics that have been in fruition for the last decade and a half, depending on how you think about them, between the French and indigenous polities are really beginning to fracture and break down. The push for plantation monoculture has pushed different groups too far, and the Natchez in particular decide that they've had enough. In 1729, they stage a massive revolt against the French, essentially expel them from the Fort Rosalie, the Natchez, the Natchez outpost, and this causes, phenomenal reverberations throughout the colony. It almost succeeds. It almost leads to the end of plantation agriculture. It almost leads to the expulsion of the French, who the colonists themselves are fed up and terrified. And it almost leads to multiple conspiracies and African and indigenous revolts and unities against French empire and slavery. So there's also something to learn in this moment about the ways that African indigenous solidarities come together and also fracture in particular ways, because from the perspective of women and girls who fall uneasily in the space of soldier and commodity, their experience is also of a particular shape. When Marie-Bode arrives, one of the things that she arrives into is all of these understandings of Blackness, of womanhood, of Africanness, of slavery, of indigeneity, of plantation, of revolt, of mastery. All of these things end up converging. And so she encounters a loss of many things as a result of arriving in this moment, in this place. And those losses and that change from one place to another, and that change in her status, that in some ways we can even think of it as a change in what the constituent elements of her Black womanhood are. That is really a key piece of how this book is trying to think through African women and girls' experiences and the crucial role that intimacy plays. So I'm going to stop there. I think that hopefully that gives enough to kind of think with and talk about. That's only one story of the many stories that are throughout the book, but I look forward to any questions and to fleshing out anything that people have to talk about. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That was so much, such a rich study. And the questions are flowing in. I want to remind everyone that you can ask a question at any time. Go ahead and put it in the Q&A. And so we'll start digging in. Maybe as moderator, I'll take I'll ask the sort of first question. One of the things that really stood out and I've kind of had planted in my mind from reading the introduction to the book is your statement, free status did not define freedom, which I think is a really sort of powerful thing. And you just put that as that short sentence. And then you sort of go on to talk about the ways, and it'd be great for you to maybe unpack that a little for our audience who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, the insights that come from that. One way, and this is a couple paragraphs later, you give this use this more wonderful language. You say, African women and women of African descent demanded freedom as a project of ecstatic Black humanity in the face of abject subjection and against slavery as social death. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what it means to really sort of approach and to focus on humanity and to focus on, sort of emotion and joy within this study, which I don't think every scholar unfortunately does.
Thank you. Yeah, I one of the things that felt very important to me in writing with these women and writing the book is to recognize the ways that freedom as we understand it is beyond the Manumission Act and beyond the Emancipation Decree. And in this, I'm not alone nor first. I think many people generally cite Saidiya Hartman's work, Scenes of Subjection, in pushing us to think about the ways that freedom, particularly after emancipation, did not necessarily attend to an acceptance of formerly enslaved humanity. But we also have folks who work on post-emancipation societies, Rebecca Scott, Thomas Holt, Frederick Cooper, so many others. And so for me, that is some of like the foundational work that I think really needs to be applied in this case to thinking about manumission and free communities of color. I did not want, and I do not want Wicked Flesh to solely be seen as a history of free women of color, although I think it certainly fits in that category. What I want it to absolutely do is taking from this foundation that freedom is not defined by, a contract, right? Which is a very kind of liberal humanistic idea of freedom, individual, you sign a contract, et cetera, et cetera. You have the freedom to do that because you are a self-conscious propertied and intelligent individual. If we don't assume that that's actually what freedom is, or if better, we assume and understand that as having a history that is the other side of slavery in this exact same moment, the 18th century, then how then might we see where freedom is being defined by African women themselves? And so, so the book is very much an investigation of, what are some of those definitions of freedom and how and where do we see them? So each chapter tries to think through what that definition might look like. If we take as this broad contour freedom as defined by control and access to safety, security, and autonomy, then that freedom actually looks very different in practice in different ways and different times and places. So on the Senegambian coast, there is a freedom to being a patron, to patronage, and to being part of a community that can protect you. On the Gulf Coast Louisiana side, freedom in part is a Manumission Act, but even enslaved women and formerly enslaved women and free women are understanding that freedom as very contingent, as a thing that can be decided or taken away. So then there's something else that they are demanding out of this thing that gets called freedom. And it's a thing that on the other side, French officials are constantly pushing against. So the slave codes and acts that continue to emerge, 1685 Code Noir, 1724 Louisiana Code Noir, 1751 police codes, they're continuing to tighten over and upon the actions and mobility, the effective labors, the sartorial politics of enslaved people as well as others. And that also shows us the ways that freedom is this contested thing that in their actions and activities, African women and women of African descent are very much pushing against and redefining in practice. And so how do we see them as critical actors in how we even understand what freedom is by the 19th century?
Wonderful. Great. Let me go to one of the questions here. One of our attendees would love to hear more about your use of intimacy as an analytic and what historical insights it affords that maybe a focus on space alone might not do. And maybe to add to that, did you start this study thinking that you were going to focus on intimacy, or is that something that came in the process?
So I'll answer the second question first. Thank you all for that question. The focus on intimacy is very much beholden to a conversation I had with Dr. Elsa Barkley Brown, and I really want to name her because she very much pushed me to think not just about kinship, which was always been my obsession. Kinship was always there, has been there from the very beginning, but pushed me to think about intimacy and what that might mean, and pushed me to think about it as something beyond sex acts, right? Because again, to kind of come back to like that, that not wanting that this is a book that is beyond the kind of, at least how we've thought of history, writing histories of free people of color before, which have been sort of very, bourgeois, the third population between slave and free, things that are problematic in a whole host of ways. And then when applied to women, almost always have some kind of, it's romantic, it's seductive, et cetera, et cetera. The illicit romance, quote unquote romance of the slave owner and the free wife of color. And so not wanting to go into those kind of questions, at first I was a little reticent to tackle intimacy. And one of the things that Dr. Barclay Brown encouraged very early on, and I'm really very grateful for her for that, was that actually my definition of intimacy was too narrow. That many of our definitions of intimacy as solely, it often kind of revolves around the sex act. And what if we think of intimacy as not necessarily about sex acts, but still about a kind of physical proximity and a physical encounter with fluid and flesh that is unusual in public and even unusual in maybe kinship spaces, but and is therefore something more, something corporeal, and something that is potentially illicit, something that's potentially carnal, but not necessarily. So intimacy for me, as I was working through the documents and the narrative, was certainly sex acts are part of that, but also what does it mean to break bread together, to touch food together? What does it mean to bathe someone, to nurse someone, to take care of them? And in this world where you really are dealing with the blood, with the urine, with the feces, with all of this, there's nobody cleaning it up after you. There's no washing machines, so there's a chapter that talks about two women who go to the river to wash clothes. They're working for the hospital, and if you can imagine a world in which there is no easy cleanup, you are dealing with literally all of the stuff, the fluvience of the human body, and that is a particular kind of intimacy. So it is not absolutely not. So that goes to the first question there, which is that the intimacy that I'm interested in is not beyond sex acts, and it is absolutely grounded in the body, though, and in bodily encounters, and what that might mean, and how that is also about the history of slavery, and also about the history of colonialism and empire. And of course, one of the names that will come to many people's mind is Ann Stoler, and yes, very much beholden to that work as well.
I'm going to put in the chat two APS resources that our colleague Estelle Markle-Joy, who's the assistant head of cataloging here at the APS, thought of while listening to your talk. So, and I'll send these to you afterwards, Jessica. You might find them really sort of interesting.
Thank you.
Great question here from Sean Gallagher, who is our David Center postdoc for the next 2 years. And he writes that he finds the framework of Black femme freedom to be incredibly generative. And along with Jennifer Morgan's recent work on mothers in the Black radical tradition, it seems like we're in a historiographic moment that centers women as the key agents of resistance within enslaved communities. He's wondering if you could speak more to what gendered and queer frameworks reveal about enslaved people's politics and enslaved organizing more generally.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that particularly Black queer and Black trans studies has been so generative in forcing scholars to really question, scholars of slavery in particular, to really question the assumptions that they make about kinship, about family formation, about community, and about sex acts. And I think that has been so generative. I'm thinking of C. Riley Norton's work has been particularly generative to me. The work on Black femme and Black lesbian work, Kyla Story, Savannah Shangay, Treva Ellis, all of these have been really critical. And I think one of the things that that work asks us to do is to make different assumptions about who is resisting and when and how, and what resistance looks like. I think that the field has often been sort of hung up on the resistor as, again, as that kind of self-conscious individual who is often gendered male, and is often like kind of messianic, like we think of like Vanessa Holden has an amazing book on the Southampton slave revolt, and is very critical of folks who continue to profess that it was Nat Turner's revolt, when she describes it and offers an amazing history and argument that it's a community of revolts. And so queer and trans work asks us to kind of question all of those assumptions, right? As I stated, it actually also asks us to question the assumptions we make about gender, the assumptions we make about age, the assumptions that we make about Blackness. So there's a kind of destabilizing of structures that I think queer and trans work offers. But I also think that there's ways that, like that proclivity we have to create these kind of hierarchies of revolt and revolution also need to be challenged. What are the ways that acts of, as I describe in the book, thinking about Black femme freedom, acts of gathering, of women gathering together, and of finding moments of joy and pleasure and escape and feast together, like physically defending each other. How are those, for me, are as radical and are the seed of a kind of armed radicalism that we tend to prioritize. So I think, and I would argue that queer and trans work, Black feminist work more broadly, asks us to kind of flip our hierarchy upside down, that we actually are looking at, for example, the Haitian Revolution as the peak of resistance and revolt. And I actually think that the moment where like Louison and Babette, confront the soldier, for those who've read the book, like those moments, I think actually those are the moments that we start from, and see those as actually as much of a confrontation with empire as the 1791 slave revolt is. So I do think that there is such amazing work that's happening, and in that, again, like, not to be messianic, I don't want to say that Black women now are the center of revolt and resistance, because I don't know if that's exactly. I don't know if it's a matter of replacing the new messiah, of being new messiahs. But I do think there is something really important about how do all of our ideas of resistance and the assumptions that we make about what enslaved wanted in resisting and in imagining new worlds and recreating and revolution, how do all of those change when we don't have these kind of heteronormative patriarchal ideas about what that work is?
In your work, and the answer you just provided speaks to just what a generative time it is right now to be doing this work. The other reality, though, of this time, this comes from a question from Molly Mediolo, one of our other long-term fellows here, is about the pandemic and the time and the way in which the archive has become, the physical archive, the one that is so on display in your work, is increasingly inaccessible. And so she asked, as a graduate student, trying to do similar work in uncovering voices, names, and stories of underrepresented groups during a time when accessing archives is challenging, and that's putting it generously, I think, and largely for those who have to rely on digital. How do you do work when you have to rely on digital resources to complete this work? I know you also do digital history work, and I want to give a shout out, and I'm running out of time, but I'll put some links to DH Against Enclosure and Taller Electric Marinage, which are absolutely fantastic work. So I'm going to fanboy a little on that. I so love the work you're doing there. What advice do you have? How does the digital archive maybe help us when we can't get into the analog archive?
Sure. This is a really tough question because I am very much team analog archive. Like, I love to be in an archive and touch and hold manuscript documents. I love, I'm not interviewing enslaved people. My time period is much later, but for folks who are doing interviews and things like that, I know that there's also something about the in-person piece of engagement. So this has been, and I say that even as I am very much a proponent of digital humanities, digital history, digital media, all of that. So, you know, I'm hurting in this COVID moment, and I feel so much for my students who, you know, we're I don't know what going back in time looks like, and so I know that their experience of research is fundamentally different from my own. So that said, I do think that this is a great time. Let me rephrase that. This is the time where I think this is a time in which I am incredibly grateful to Black feminist work and Black feminist archival work that has asked us to think differently about sources and about documents. So in a lot of ways, like I am, you know, I'm shockingly empiricist. Like I love like the more documents and more footnotes I can pack into a project, the better. You'll see that in this book. There's like a lot of footnotes. But also, I think that this is also maybe a good time to think about, you know, where digital archives are at, certainly, but also what do we need to keep in mind when we think about what is missing? I mean, we talk about that and then we get into like the brick and mortar archive and we're like, documents, it's amazing. We have everything we need. And like that kind of critical analysis that we had sort of stepping back and saying, well, of course, the brick and mortar archive doesn't have everything that was written. Of course, we only have so many documents that remain with us. Of course, African diaspora documents, in my field at least, are scattered across continents. You know, I went to 3 different continents to try and find the material to create this text. I think this is a really important time to kind of step into some of these critiques and think about, okay, how do we practice the kind of radical analysis of archive and of document that scholars, particularly Black feminist scholars, have been calling us into? What do our dissertations, our books, our publications, our blogs, our digital projects, and everything else look like when we, you know, think differently about what kind of history we're creating? What do our audiences look like? Because not only have the archives changed, but who we're writing to, I think, is shifting a lot. And in the realm of Black historical thought, at least, it is like a renaissance. There's amazing books out there for broader and broader publics, and there's also amazing digital projects, the 1619 Project included, which I'm a huge fan of. And so what are the ways that we think differently about that as we're doing our research? And for those of us who are, you know, beyond the grad student role, what are the ways that as faculty we're also calling attention to this? We're holding our committees accountable, holding our institutions accountable. So there is that. For still the, you know, the empiricist grad student in the room who wants to like kind of dig deep into this, there are some really rich things happening among archives and institutions as far as digitizing collections, and as far as making documents available. I was really excited about the ways that you know, the National Archives in the UK stepped into digitizing their records. Centre des Archives d'Outre-mer in France also had workshops around their digital archives. So this is also a time to get really cozy over email with archivists, with librarians, with curators, and start making the kinds of relationships that maybe, you know, if for an introvert are a little shy about, but, you know, like, you know, working with, you know, individuals who, you know, are able to maybe create PDFs, drop things into a Google Drive. All of these things are very much possible. And so, you know, as COVID showed us, it's going to be working in community that we get these things done, and our communities, you know, do include the folks, you know, like at the APS who are doing this work very much on the ground and doing their best to make as much available as possible.
We are definitely trying all of this, and we appreciate both the use of our collections by scholars and also the patience of scholars as we try to get back up and running. Well, thank you so much. I know we've kept you over the hour that we initially asked you to be here for. I want to just say once again that everybody watching, if you have not already got your copy, please go out and order your copy of Wicked Flesh. 40% off. I mean, it'd be wrong not to do it. I just want to give one little plug for an event we have next week, book launch for an APS publication, Indigenous Languages and the Promise of Archives. So it's good that we ended thinking about the archives. An absolutely fantastic anthology. Some really fantastic Indigenous scholars who will be talking about their work in it. That's next next week, December 8th at 1 p.m. Jessica, thank you so much for giving us your time, and be well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming.